A stone tablet fragment sits in a climate-controlled case at the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, catalogued, photographed, and rarely displayed. It is a list: metallurgy, cosmetics, root cutting, sky reading, the making of blades, a curriculum. The same curriculum appears, item for item, in a text church leaders removed from the record at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Banned, hidden, called dangerous. For 17 centuries, that was the end of it. Then, in 1947, 11 separate copies of the Book of Enoch surfaced in the caves at Qumran. More copies than Deuteronomy. More than Exodus. More than most books that stayed in the canon. Whoever kept that library did not treat this text as a curiosity. They copied it more carefully than the law. And what the text contains is not a vision. It is a list of specific technologies, named instructors, and the exact moment human civilization changed. Not a myth, not a metaphor. Enoch names the beings who taught it. He names each subject. He records what happened to the world after. In the next several minutes, you will see what the text says, which technologies it names, and why access to the oldest Ge'ez manuscripts has been restricted since 1974. If forbidden history fascinates you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from the record. But here's what makes this stranger. The passage sits in chapters 7 and 8, inside the section scholars call the Book of the Watchers, the oldest layer of the entire Enochic corpus. Fragment 4, Q201, held at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, preserves Aramaic text from exactly these chapters and carbon dates to roughly 200 BCE. That fragment is older than any New Testament text by more than 200 years. Michael Nibb's 1978 Oxford edition, still the standard English reference, works from the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript tradition, preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which never removed the book from its canon. And in that tradition, chapter 8 does something apocalyptic literature almost never does. It stops speaking in symbols and starts keeping records. The level of detail is wrong for ancient religious writing. Apocalyptic texts deal in beasts, horns, thrones, numbers that mean something other than numbers. Chapter 8 gives none of that. It gives names attached to job functions, it gives materials, it gives a sequence of instruction, and a described social outcome. First-person witness, past tense, itemized. Read it cold, with no theological expectation, and it reads like a personnel roster attached to a technology transfer log. Someone taught something. Here is who, here is what it did. And this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. The first is metallurgy. Chapter 8-1 states that Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, and showed them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. The mainstream reading treats this as a myth, explaining why war exists. Evil enters the world through a fallen figure, a standard ideological story. But look at what the verse actually specifies. Not weapons in general. A sequence. First, the ores, then the working of them, then 4 distinct products. 2 offensive, 2 defensive, in that order. That is the actual archaeological order of the Bronze Age military package. Extraction, smelting, then edged weapons, then plate protection. The text does not say Azazel gave them swords. It says he showed them the metals of the earth and taught the art. The difference is the difference between a gift and a training program. But the text doesn't stop there. The same verse continues into something no myth about the origin of war needs. Chapter 8-1 says he also taught them bracelets, ornaments, the use of antimony, the beautifying of the eyelids, and all kinds of costly stones and dyes. Cosmetics, in the middle of a weapons list. Every commentator for 2,000 years has treated this as a moralizing aside about vanity. But antimony is a real substance with a real history. Ground stibnite, dark gray, used as coal across the ancient Near East, and it appears in the same verse as ore extraction because it comes from the same process. Antimony is a metallurgical byproduct. Smelting operations produce it. The text groups cosmetics with weapons not because both are sinful, but because both come out of the same furnace. Whoever wrote chapter 8 knew that. There is no theological reason to know that. What follows in chapter 8 to 3 is stranger still. The text abandons the single instructor and gives a distributed faculty, each named being teaches one specialization and only one. Semjaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Baraki Jal taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught the knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Shamziel, the signs of the sun. Sariel, the course of the moon. Read that list slowly. Root cutting is pharmacology, the extraction of active compounds from plant material. The resolving of enchantments is a separate discipline from enchantments themselves, which means the text distinguishes between an effect and its reversal, between a toxin and an antidote. Then, 4 separate sky disciplines, split by object, constellations, clouds, sun, moon. Not one astronomer. 4, each with a domain, and 1 earth specialist for the signs of the ground, which in every ancient context means reading terrain for water, minerals, and seismic behavior. The surface reading calls this a demonology, a list of evil spirits and their vices. But nothing in the structure behaves like a vice list. Vice lists are moral, and they overlap. This does not overlap. Each entry occupies a distinct technical domain with no redundancy, and together they cover metallurgy, pharmacology, meteorology, astronomy, and geology. That is not a catalog of sins. That is a faculty directory. And then comes the part that shouldn't be possible. Chapter 8 to 4 gives the outcome, and the outcome is not what a morality tale produces. The text says that as men perished, they cried out, and their voice reached heaven. Not that they became wicked, that they perished, and at scale, and that the disruption was severe enough that chapters 9 and 10 describe a response operation. The knowledge transfer is described as having a casualty figure. A myth about vanity does not need a body count. An incident report does. Here's what the translators left out. Chapter 8 to 3, in the standard English editions, including R.H. Charles's 1906 translation that most readers still quote, renders Semjaza's subject as enchantments and root cuttings. The Ge'ez underlying that phrase is built on a term that carries a double register. It covers the binding, the spell, the curse, the thing done at a distance to a body. It also covers the preparation itself, the compound, the mixture that does the work. Charles chose the supernatural sense and standardized it for English readers for over a century. The manuscript tradition permits both, and the pairing with root cuttings in the very same clause makes the second reading the more natural one. You do not teach spellcasting alongside plant dissection. You teach plant dissection alongside what you extract from the plant. Now apply that to Armaros. The standard rendering gives him the resolving of enchantments, which sounds like counter magic. Under the same reading, it is the neutralizing agent, the antidote discipline, taught as its own subject by its own instructor because it is a separate body of knowledge from the thing it reverses. Charles's footnote to the passage dismisses the whole verse as a list of demonic arts and moves on. He does not ask why an ancient text separates toxicology from pharmacology and assigns them different teachers. He did not have to ask. He had already decided what kind of document he was reading. The text moves on, but the implication sits there. What modern readers don't realize is how closely this matches what the archaeological record actually shows about the moment in question. Chapter 8 describes a compressed period in which metallurgy, cosmetic chemistry, plant pharmacology, and systematic sky observation all appear at once in the same population. For most of the 20th century, that was assumed to be impossible because technologies were understood to develop slowly and independently. Then Göbekli Tepe was excavated in southeastern Turkey beginning in 1995 under Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute. Radiocarbon dating placed the monumental enclosures at roughly 9,500 BCE, thousands of years before pottery, before writing, before the wheel, and before settled agriculture in that region. Multi-ton limestone pillars, quarried, shaped, transported, and set with carved relief, produced by people the standard model classified as pre-agricultural foragers. The site broke the sequence. It showed advanced, organized capability arriving before the developmental stages that were supposed to produce it. And the region matters. Göbekli Tepe sits in the upper Mesopotamian corridor, within a few hundred kilometers of Mount Hermon, the location Enoch chapter 6 to 6 names, as the descent point, the place where the instructors are said to have come down and bound themselves by oath before the teaching began. Chapter 6 gives a coordinate. The Archaeology gives an anomaly. They are in the same neighborhood. The text describes a sudden arrival of organized technical knowledge in the upper Mesopotamian region before the developmental sequence allows for it. The excavation found organized monumental capability in the upper Mesopotamian region before the developmental sequence allows for it. The parallel is not metaphorical, it is structural. And there is a second layer. Antimony, the substance chapter 8 to 1 names by function, appears in Mesopotamian metallurgy far earlier than the general adoption of complex alloying. And studies of early Anatolian and Caucasian metalwork have documented antimony-bearing copper artifacts predating the broad Bronze Age transition. The text places antimony processing in the same instructional package as ore extraction and weapon manufacture. The metallurgical record places antimony as an early byproduct of exactly that extraction. The sequence in the verse matches the sequence in the ground. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Enoch was excluded from the canon and its circulation discouraged. The stated objections were theological, but chapters 7 and 8 carried a specific problem the symbolic passages did not. They attributed the origin of human technology to a named non-human source in a named geographical location with an itemized inventory. That is a claim with an address. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate around 400 CE, dismissed the book as apocryphal and not worth the labor of translation. Augustine, writing in the City of God around 410 CE, argued that whatever genuine material Enoch might contain had been so corrupted that the church could not accept any of it. Neither man engaged the instruction list. Neither explained why a text that early groups antimony with smelting. The Ethiopian Church, operating independently of Rome, kept the book in its canon and preserved the only complete version on earth in Ge'ez. Europe had nothing but fragments and citations until the Scottish traveler James Bruce carried 3 GES manuscripts out of Ethiopia in 1773. When Richard Lawrence produced the first English translation from those manuscripts in 1821, the reception to chapters 7 and 8 was hostile in a specific way. Reviewers did not argue the passage was false. They argued it was beneath examination, a crude fable unworthy of scholarly attention. That framing held for a century. Charles's 1906 edition preserved it in the footnotes. Then the ground shifted. The Qumran discoveries in 1947 confirmed the Aramaic original was centuries older than anyone had allowed, and the fragments touching cosmology, angelology, and the instruction lists were assigned low publication priority. The Aramaic Enoch material sat largely unpublished for nearly 3 decades before Joseph Millick's edition appeared in 1976. And access to the oldest Ge'ez manuscript collections in Ethiopia tightened after 1974, when the revolution brought church archives under state classification as national cultural property. Requests for direct examination of certain manuscript witnesses have gone unanswered for decades. The pattern is consistent. The objection was never only theological. The text made a testable claim about where human technology came from. And testable claims are dangerous. Now, here's where it gets active. In the last decade, portions of the Göbekli Tepe complex have been deliberately reburied, a preservation decision on the record, and defended as such. Geophysical survey indicates the majority of the site remains unexcavated, with the number of buried enclosures estimated well above what has been opened. A researcher formerly attached to survey work in the region, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the excavation pace as governed by considerations that were never entirely archaeological. What is currently visible at the site is a fraction of what the ground scans show is there. The rest stays covered. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying non-human instructors landed on a mountain in the Levant and ran a technical academy for early humans. The Book of Enoch is not a training manual, and Göbekli Tepe is not a schoolhouse. But what the text describes, when you read it carefully, matches the documented record more closely than it has any business doing. It groups antimony with smelting, and antimony is a smelting byproduct. It separates toxicology from pharmacology and gives each its own instructor, a distinction the ancient world rarely drew. It splits sky observation into 4 discrete disciplines by object. It places the whole event in the upper Mesopotamian corridor, and that corridor produced monumental construction thousands of years before the model says it could. The author had no metallurgical chemistry, no radiocarbon dating, no excavation reports. He should not know that cosmetics and weapons come out of the same furnace. And yet the text sits there in Ge'ez and Aramaic, saying what it has said for over 2,000 years. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If Chapter 8 lists 9 technical disciplines with no overlap and correct internal groupings, if it places antimony in the metallurgical package where the chemistry actually puts it, if it names a location in the upper Mesopotamian corridor, and that corridor produced Göbekli Tepe, and if a text older than the Gospels records all of this as an itemized inventory rather than a symbol, then the text is not mythology. It is documentation. Enoch went somewhere. He saw something. He wrote it down with the same matter-of-fact tone you'd use filing an inventory for a shipment received. The list he gives is either a moral fable we have misread for 2 millennia, or it is exactly what it appears to be, a record of what was taught, by whom, and in what order. Fragment 4Q201 sits under glass in Jerusalem. The complete GES manuscripts sit in Ethiopia behind stone and state classification. The reburied enclosures sit under soil in southeastern Turkey, mapped and unopened. Bruce's manuscripts sit in Oxford. The list is still there. The names are still on it, and the knowledge it says was handed down is still in our hands, still working exactly the way Enoch said it would. There is more that was removed from the record. The next investigation is on screen now.